Welcome to the DC Bar Community's Law Student Podcast with your hosts,
Melody Al-Mansour, third-year student at Georgetown University Law Center.
Elena Hoffman, first-year student at the George Washington University Law School.
Renata Mitchell, second-year student at the George Washington University Law School.
And Alexis Bird, third-year student at UDC David A. Clark School of Law.
You're listening to Let's Brief It.
Hello, everyone. My name is Melody.
And my name is Elena.
And welcome to our next episode of the DC Bar Student Community Podcast, Let's Brief It.
In today's episode, we'll discuss government contracts with our guest Amy Garber.
Amy is a senior associate at the DC office of the law firm Bradley Arent. Amy's practice focuses on construction and government contracts, including arbitration and litigation of complex construction claims at the state and federal level and before the federal boards of contract appeals. Amy also counsels clients on the negotiation of large-scale construction projects.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Amy. So let's start with the basics. What does it actually mean to be a government contracts lawyer, and how did you originally get into this field?
Well, first off, thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here. So government contracts law is very, very broad. There's a rather tight-knit community of lawyers who do it. But it spans a lot of different industries and a lot of types of practice. You have a big chunk of it, which is bid protest work, which is the fast-paced, juicy, oftentimes situation where a contractor is challenging an award of the contract to another entity. And there's many different layers to that. And then you have litigation that arises out of contractors who contract with the federal government for various types of work, engineering work, delivering certain equipment and sometimes devices, computer services, infrastructure, and then you have construction, which can be anything from building a hospital on an army base to building an embassy in another country. So there's really a lot to it and a lot of different niches to it. And also I would note that while government contract lawyers, I would venture to guess 99.9% of them do mostly federal work, government contracts exist on different levels. So you can have a case with a local water authority for a city. You can have contracts with a state, and each states generally have their own procurement and government contracts body of law that sometimes tracks the federal law, but it's often a little different and complicated to navigate. And so that can be quite interesting. How I got involved in government contracts law was almost completely by accident. So I started my career in 2008 at a big DC law firm, and I was doing general commercial litigation. And at that time, law firms were not doing so great. A big law firm in DC collapsed, and the firm I was at took in their construction and government contracts group, and I got to know them socially. I really liked them, really enjoyed them. And lo and behold, the firm that I was at also collapsed. To make a long story short, I ended up at a firm with some of those people that I had met through my old firm, started doing more and more construction and government contracts, really liked it, and my career took that trajectory, and now that's pretty much all I do, and I love it.
Can you talk a bit more about how litigation fits into the government contracts process, or how we're to think of those two as different umbrellas or overlapping umbrellas?
Sure. So litigation in its general sense starts at the claim level. I'm going to talk about it from the perspective of a construction project, just to give you an example. So when we get pulled in, it's typically at the claim level where the contractor is officially putting together their claim for payment for the government. So early on in the project, they'll be submitting applications for payment and notices of what they consider changes to the contract that might require them to get paid additional costs or to be given more time on the schedule for the project. And if that starts becoming problematic and the government is not playing ball, they'll start putting together a more formal claim. And some of these claims can be small. Some of them can be upwards of $40 million. It just depends on the scale of the issue. And obviously on larger issues, the lawyers tend to get involved more quickly. So at the claim level, we'll get pulled in and we'll help what we call sanitize the claim. And we typically work with accountants who look at the numbers and consultants on the schedule, and we'll all kind of sit down and make sure that before this claim is officially submitted, it's accurate. And one of the important things to remember always in government contracting is that you're always certifying to the government that what you're doing is accurate. And if even by accident that certification doesn't end up being correct, it can cause major problems. And I think we'll talk later a little bit about the False Claims Act and what that means. But once you submit the claim, the government has typically 60 days to either issue a decision on the claim or decide that they need more time and let the contractor know. Once they issue their final decision, assuming it's something that the contractor isn't happy with, then they have time to appeal that decision. And it goes either to the Court of Federal Claims or it can go to the Board of Contract Appeals. So, for example, in construction, we have a lot of projects where the contractor is contracting with the United States Army Corps of Engineers, which are engineers in the armed services, and they do large construction projects, which, as I mentioned before, can be a hospital, it can be an embassy, something on an army base, academic buildings for let's say the Naval Academy or something like that. So those cases, when they get appealed, typically go to what's called the Armed Services Board of Contract Appeals. And it's a board of judges who hear the cases, and it's very much like litigation in a court. There's some differences in how the rules of evidence apply. They don't apply as strictly generally. And in filing, you typically file by email. You send things to the board rather than by mail or by online services like you do in federal court. So there's little differences, but typically it follows the same trajectory as litigation in a court in other areas of law. And so then you have a trial or a hearing, and the judge issues a decision, and there's certain internal processes at the board that they have to come to issue a decision. I think it's that the judge needs to have 2 other judges sign off on their decision, and then they issue it, and there's more of an appeals process if you're not happy with that, and that's when it goes back into the regular court system. And so that's generally the litigation process in a nutshell.
So you mentioned the Board of Contract Appeals. Can you run us through a little more of who they are, how you get on it, what they do?
Sure. So the different agencies in the government that contract with various entities have different boards where you appeal claims. So I talked before about the Armed Services Board of Contract Appeals. That's a big one. They hear a lot of big cases because there's a lot of contracts with the Army and Navy and Armed Services. But there's also the Civilian Board of Contract Appeals. There's the Postal Service. There's the Aviation Board of Contract Appeals. So all different types of contracts kind of have their own niche, and the different boards have different judges who are very more often than not qualified based on their background to hear cases that deal with that area. Because, a lot of these cases are very fact specific. So you have certain areas of law where it's very law heavy. And certainly in government contracts, there's a lot of law and there's a lot of important cases and a lot of important precedents. But there's also a lot of specific facts to each case, which oftentimes you'll never hear again. They're very specific, very technical. You could have one case where you're learning about the properties of soil or how cement cures, and then you have another case and you're learning about computer programming. It's really, really specific. And obviously the subject matter is very different in a case dealing with aviation, aerospace, or something that would go to the Postal Service versus a big construction project. So there's just a lot of different areas.
And in terms of the statutes you deal with on a daily basis, you had alluded to the False Claims Act. Can you talk a little bit about that and the Anti-Kickback Statutes and how they fit into your day-to-day work?
Sure. So just to go back to my day-to-day work in statutes, I would say the ones that we are constantly looking at is the Federal Acquisition Regulations, which is the FAR, which are federal regulations, but they govern all federal contracts, and case law kind of builds on those, and there's standard provisions in every contract that come from the FAR. So those are kind of the critical ones that we look at every day. The False Claims Act and the Anti-Kickback Statute, I would say, are looming in the shadows every day, and sometimes they come out and sometimes they don't. In my work specifically, I think there are attorneys who are dealing with those statutes every day and deal specifically or heavily with issues that come up with those statutes, but we kind of use them more to advise clients on how to keep on the straight and narrow and keep doing what they're doing. We do some trainings for that, and we kind of walk the clients through at every level on a construction project, whether you're dealing with the putting together the payment applications or you're on the field every day managing the project, how what you do during the day affects the False Claims Act. So from a very broad overview, and I think I mentioned this before, the False Claims Act, it doesn't necessarily deal with claims, but it deals with what you're representing and certifying to the government on a daily basis has to be accurate and true. So, for example, every time a contractor submits an application for payment to the government, they sign a certification that they've complied with the contract, they've paid their subcontractors, and all of the numbers are accurate. And sometimes things happen where you can have a subcontractor who's not paying its own employees and the contractor doesn't know about it. And so they're just signing off that everything is accurate, and they're submitting the subcontractor's request for payment, and then they realize, well, the subcontractor's in violation of a different law. There's a law called the Davis-Bacon Wage Act that requires you to pay the correct wages to your employees. Well, if the subcontractor, unbeknownst to the contractor, isn't doing that, and now the contractor's certifying to the government that everything is fair and accurate on their application, contractors on the hook for that. And there are ways to make disclosures to the government and smooth situations like that over or make sure they don't happen in the first place. And that's where the lawyers come in too on a daily basis counseling. In terms of the Anti-Kickback Statute, all of that has to do with kind of how to not even have the appearance that you are receiving or providing anything to the government that could even look like you're trying to get favorable treatment. So, you could be friends with someone after working with them on the project every day and decide to take a government official out to dinner or to a baseball game or something, but you can't do things like that. And so that might not qualify as a kickback, but there's a lot of nuances to those laws and a lot of ways to play it safe that we counsel our clients on and make sure that they're aware of.
So are there any interesting or particularly controversial cases you can think of that our listeners might be interested in hearing about?
Sure. I think there are some very juicy cases, especially in the bid protest world. I personally will not bore you with my personal experiences, which I tend to find more interesting, but we maybe won't talk about cement or soil today. Okay. But there are cases that make the news, and especially with bid protests, because you have such a wide range of big projects. And there's one that's been in the news you might have heard about, but the Pentagon awarded a $10 billion cloud infrastructure project dealing with, I guess, the cloud and the technical infrastructure of the computer systems. They awarded it to Microsoft, and Amazon has filed a bid protest saying, well, this is preferential treatment by the president, or I don't know the specific details of it, but they filed a bid protest. I think a lot of it was under seal, so it's kind of hard to gauge exactly what they're saying, but they were not happy. And so that's a very juicy example because it kind of involves politics and the issues of the day and, technology and these big monster companies. You don't always have that, but you do have some juicy cases. And in the bid protest, things move very fast, and there's a lot of technical aspects to it. And, it is important to note that a lot of it is under seal or confidential because sometimes you're dealing with very classified engineering information or proprietary information, or, it could be a project that's very sensitive to the government and even security, national security, things like that. So, there's a lot of procedures you have to follow where things are kept quiet.
Kind of on that note, what's a more maybe interesting fact or juicy fact about the field that the general public or even law students might not be aware of when it comes to government contracts?
So I don't know about a juicy fact, but I will say that it is a very good, I don't know if the word is industry because it covers a lot of industries, but it's a good field in terms of camaraderie. We have a lot of, especially in DC, learning events and networking events where judges and board judges, people who are experts in the field, attorneys who have been at this for 30, 40 years, and attorneys who are a couple years out of law school will all get together and learn from each other and get to know each other. There are events where people can meet board judges and just talk to them in a casual atmosphere. And I really find that it's a collegial environment and it's a fun one to work in.
So perhaps a misconception, not just about this field or other fields, is that the lawyers are siloed, but it's clear that they're not, that there is a lot of camaraderie.
There is. And I think, and I'm sure that this arises in other areas of law, or I hope it does, but when you have even a very tense adversarial litigation situation, at the end of the day, you're professionals and you can really respect the people who are on the other side. And I think that's prevalent. Another misconception that I have to talk about in the construction world is that I think people would think of construction and maybe think that it's a man's industry or a man's world. But it's not, and that's changing a lot. There's a very big presence of women in construction and government contracts law, and it's great.
That's awesome.
So do you have any advice for law students, prospective law students, or just any interested members of the public who would want to gain more knowledge or experience in the field?
Sure. So the steering committee that I'm on, the Government Contracts Committee, and I think the DC Bar steering committees in general, very welcoming to law students. I think we have a committee of law students, and we love to get them involved in any area that they would be interested in, including government contracts. And I know we put on a lot of informative events. And in terms of furthering your career as a growing attorney, the Board of Contract Appeals have some very good internships, as does the Court of Federal Claims, and I think the Department of Justice has some that are in the courts division that deals with the government contracts type trials. So that's something to look into if you're really serious about a career in government contracts. If you just want reading material, there's a lot of newsletters out there and sources. My law firm has a blog called Build Smart, which is not only focused on construction. We cover a lot of key bid protest cases and government contracts cases. And so if there's anything that comes out that's a big deal, you'll hear about it from us. There are ways to subscribe to that. So I think just keeping your eyes open for it, it's really a big industry.
Well, Amy, thank you so much for joining us today and talking through your day-to-day work. It's been really interesting.
For sure.
Thank you so much for having me. This was so fun.